Ariel,
Hey Jen, how you doing?
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine. I'm just gonna say done with midterm project going over. I've seen them. I think I
I
just
envy you.
do a couple more like administrative things, but
I'm almost done. Some of my folks have already received grades, and the rest of the folks should get it by today or tomorrow.
oh really?
Oh, the struggle is real. The struggle is real. I'm trying to find time. Just find there's just not enough hours in the day, but the work is
Yeah,
good. The work is really good.
hard to find the time to kind of really sit down and just focus on things, and then other things
Yeah,
come in,
yeah,
right?
I know. I hear that.
All right. Well, anyways, like today we said that we would talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we were thinking about, noticing, and reading in student midterm projects, design projects, right? What are your general impressions, like as you went through this?
Well, I really like the fact that people were able to take something. A lot of folks targeted things that they've experienced,
Mhm.
things that they've actually gone through. They've had the muscle memory around going through, and people came up with some really creative and great improvements for their redesign. So I think overall the work was very well done. Um, I think there are a few recommendations I have. I think that go across a lot of different group or individual papers because our sections had some folks that worked individually. But overall, it was really good. I have a real good feeling about this one.
So, for example, if you had to break it down to like, I don't know, like I was like
Top
three
three
things
issues.
that whatever, but like it's like we don't have to go with numbers. One thing you thought was like done really well and an example of it, and one thing that you think that students need to be more mindful of, and an example of that. And it doesn't even have to be like a actual student example. It can be an analogy, right? Something you make up on the fly to hide, right? Like,
I do. So.
but the
Well,
the you know what I mean, right?
yeah, totally. So I think because this was popular, so a lot of folks, this is probably um, a mix of a positive. I'll start with the constructive feedback.
Mhm.
Start with that one. So I think a lot of people became more comfortable being able to back up their ideas with certain theories and to go deeply into thinking about what learning is actually happening here. I think it would have been good, I think, if I could see folks take constructivism to the next step. So I think I saw folks like they use constructivism, using that one as an example, as something that they would use as the framework for their redesigns. But we didn't think through all the things that constructivism could be.
What does that mean in terms of like concrete examples?
Yeah, so let's think about like I love the opportunity to have student choice. That was a very popular one,
Uh-huh.
as that being constructivist. But then sometimes we leave it there and we say like that's it. We don't think about maybe perhaps there are other ways to shift the instructor role so that that instructor can be like what we saw in our textbook. This one, there's like a
Uh-huh.
little summary at the end. Talks
Yeah, there was
about
a
the
textbook somewhere in this class, right?
yeah, somewhere. And then it has a summary of what constructivist instruction looks like
Mhm.
and how that might help people think through what components or characteristics your design might want to have if you are recommending constructivist approaches to education. So I talked about, let's just use that as an example. I talked about how the instructor changes kind of role. They're not a sage on the stage. I use those words exactly. They're guiding from the side. Well, what kind of materials can you create to be able to help somebody take on that role? What would those materials look like? How does that align with your goal, the goal that you identified, one goal, and not like a bunch of different goals? What are other things that we have here in the summary for what constructivist education or constructivist learning might look like? How is this student driven? How can you change this design so that the learners do have more control over their learning? So there are just some things that I think we think about it as I want to do this one thing and therefore it is constructivist, as opposed to it's more of a philosophy that encompasses a lot of different characteristics in a design rather than just one thing, and therefore it is constructivist. So I think that's one thing that I wish folks had the time to get into. Maybe it was the nature of the assignment, the time that we had, or perhaps we just had too many things we wanted to tackle at once so that you can't really go deeply into one thing or the other. But those are things that I really wish folks could explore maybe in the final. Just doing a little bit of a deeper dive into what that looks like and what that means. And why does it actually benefit the learning experience?
Yeah, when you say that, I think it echoes something we said like a while ago, right? Which is this idea of what's the difference between like a design and just saying what constructivism is, right?
Yeah.
So for example, it's like when you say like, well, constructivism or giving students choice, right? Like everyone comes in different with different backgrounds. So choices and opportunities.
Yeah, yeah, that's a
Um,
popular one.
that's kind of like just like a very large overarching principle, right, of constructivist thought, but
Mhm.
it's not the design, right, in my mind, right? So the way I want to hear things is if you're going to give students choice, what kinds of choice, right? And, in choosing different choices, options, how does that relate back to what exactly it is that you want students to be learning, right? And that's that kind of keener understanding of what is it that students don't have in their head or that you're trying to help them to construct. I think you need to have that insight in order to be able to, as a designer, prescribe what that choice looks like. And this is kind of going back to this idea of collaboration, collaborative, shared, and participatory communities, an important aspect of constructivism. So we will have that. That's not, to me, a design. That's like citing a principle that comes from constructivist thought. To me, the design is sort of like, okay, so if collaboration is important, what aspects of understanding is going to benefit from what kind of particular collaborative interactions? And therefore, what kinds of supports, like what kinds of difficulties would a collaborative activity, thoughtful activity run into that a teacher would support in what way?
Mhm.
That kind of understanding and specification from the designer standpoint is what I think is necessary in order to say that this is a design and not just saying, right, we should do this, or,
Yeah,
like in a very broad, vague kind of way.
yeah.
And like I would say, like, for the most part, with the ones that I've read, there are varying degrees of that. It wasn't too problematic with my group. I think, and I think part of the reason for that is I think in general, my students did a not so bad job
Not
of
so bad.
it's like I can't say they did excellent because they'll be like, I don't have to learn anything anymore. I gotta always be a little bit
That's an
mean, so they're
improvement.
continually like refining what they're thinking. But not so bad job of looking at phenomenon and trying to understand what that phenomenon is like, not just from observing on a surface or the content level, but what the phenomenon is like from the learner's perspective and what they understand and don't understand. And I think part of the success of that is maybe two things. One, I do think that this year, with the inclusion of having students analyze, like watch some kind of, or, like experience some kind of a designed learning thing, perhaps, right? I mean, I'm kind of conjecturing here. It helped them to first actually literally have to go through the steps of, as somebody consuming this design, right?
Mhm. Yes,
What am
absolutely.
I thinking? What do I not know? How am I constructing my understanding of it? So again, it's like that kind of understanding comes in many different ways. One, I mean, you could, as we've all been students at some point, so we have that experience. And that can be also dangerous because sometimes it biases us to our own ways that we've constructed things or didn't, right? And we only consider that. But that is one way of understanding, right? Another way, like as a teacher, right? Like if you have lots of experience in the field, you have literally dozens and dozens and dozens of different student cases that you've built and talked to and stuff. So that's in your head. But without that, it's really hard. Another way is through literature, right? That you can kind of vicariously feel what other people's struggles and stuff are. So to me, right, that it, not to kind of be very general, but like empathy, beyond just here's the content, but from the learner perspective, what is being constructed and how, help them to be able to articulate in more concrete terms directly learning related objectives, goals, and a rationale of how they're connected to each other,
Yeah.
the sequence and whatever. The second thing I think that also helped my group, which is something that like I harp on a lot, is this idea of being able to look at phenomenon in more specific ways from the learning perspective. And I think that starts with conceptualization and vocabulary that represents those conceptualizations of different kinds of learning. So in my class, I often do this thing like, all right, if you want people to say things or see things or feel things or do things, right? there's many ways we can divide this pie, but maybe a starting point is to understand there's differentiation between knowing facts and knowing explanations, right? If you know facts, you want them to recall. If you know explanations, you want them to make inferences. If it's about perceptual sensory seeing, familiarity versus discernment. And, again, like for the most part, right? I think a lot of students, when framed with that, they were able to be like, oh, okay, now when I think about my experience going through this, I'm looking for what facts were in this design, right? What kind of explanations would I be able to make, based on this current design? What am I forced to be able to, see something and recognize it, or tell the difference between it, or do something, or have an attitude? And that naturally translates into objectives that are defined, scoped, measurable, right? Operationalized, which, once you have that, then a lot of students tended to follow that as a structure to talk about their redesign.
Yep.
Meaning, and that's kind of what it is, right? If you know you need to accomplish 1, 2, 3, then your design section, I mean, mentally, you should be organizing it in a way of what are all the creative ways I can think of that directly address number 1, which is I just need them to memorize things.
Yeah.
Right? Or I need them to be able to see something and be like, that's this. Or I need to be able to see 2 things and be like, the difference is this, right? And so, it's like, it's this again, I see this a lot, so people might get sick, but it really does start, I think, with clear objectives and goals and things of that nature. But coming to that is a function of understanding and thinking and seeing, right, different kinds of learning. And I think, like, for students who struggled early in defining exactly what those things are, or in ways that are granular enough, it shows later because there's no clear guide as to where the boundaries of their design or redesign space are. There's no good check stop to think about for each thing that I'm designing or including. Does this directly hit back to, what's the litmus test of whether I know this is a good design or not?
Mm-hmm.
And so, this the kind of dilemma, right? If you can't do the early kind of planning, scoping, it's hard to really do the more concrete later stages of stuff.
Yeah. And I will say, as somebody who took this course, how many centuries ago? I took it a long time ago. But I remember the hardest part for me was picking something that not biting off more than I can chew. Right. So like the scope of that project, trying to redesign an entire, I think mine was like faculty development initiative. It was something where it was just like so large that it was very hard for me to distill down what I was actually trying to do within the scope of this project. And I think a lot of folks in my section might have done something similar. Like they worked through it probably better than I did at the time. But they would look at something like redesigning an entire suite of apps or something that cover similar topics. And I'm like, wait, that's a big, big, big thing that's going on here.
Yeah, scope is
A lot.
definitely something that I think it's hard for students. Yeah, I mean, there's some aspects of scope that I don't really hold students responsible to, in the sense of, like, in reality, right? Like, there's all these different constraints that make you decide where you want to focus or where you can or can't.
Oh yeah, like budget and other stuff. Yeah.
Right. And we don't really get that deep into that. I think that's a really complex thing. So, when I think about scope, the thing that I'm really trying to get across, right, is this idea of, there's every piece of learning is connected to other pieces of learning.
Mhm.
You have a model of how you think that, if I think in general, my learners start here and I need to get them here to be able to do these things, what is my idea of how different kinds of learning are required in order to achieve the next learning that eventually gets to a reasonable assumption that they'll be able to do this outcome that they want. But when it comes to scope, obviously for something like this, which was, I don't know, like 2 pages or something of analysis, and then like maybe another 3, 4 pages of the actual design, there really isn't a lot of space to be talking about things. So, it's like the exercise here really is about thinking of, okay, if we can't cover everything in the model, your model of how you think learning works, the little bits that lead to other little bits that lead to the outcome, what are you betting on in terms of the most important aspects? And can you go deeply into that?
Mm,
And that's a hard thing, I think, for learners. And I'm not, I guess like part of it is one, I don't know how to describe this. I'm used to making tough decisions like we can only focus on one, so I'm going to try to cut. And that requires us to prioritize and have a reason for prioritizing certain kinds of objectives over others, right?
yeah, and I think that comes
Uh,
with experience too.
yeah, and maybe that's also comes from like having a larger set of readings and the stuff to inform what I think is more relevant or direct or will have greater effect, where students don't have that to make that decision, right? So that I can understand and comprehend is difficult for students. How do you make a cut if you don't know how to prioritize what is what or what's going to give you more bang for the buck, right? But at the same time, it's like it's hard to see like a pretty good rationale for it. Here are all the different things we think is important. If we had no constraints, yeah, like I could see how this would be a good model that's very full, right? But then because of the constraints of the paper, which is 7 pages, they talk about each one in these very general ways that don't really go deeply into the specifics of, like we were talking before, right? Like collaboration, right? So if we're talking about collaboration, right, the one sentence version is because it's constructivist, we should collaborate.
Yeah.
And then you move on to the next objective or whatever, like, but like you could probably talk 3 paragraphs about the collaboration, right? One paragraph to talk about why that collaboration and to what degree, like what aspect of understanding you're going to use that collaborative opportunity for. You could have a second paragraph to talk about what kinds of ways students would interact with each other and illustrate how their mental models are being built, constructing understanding around that challenging thing that you said collaboration could benefit. And then the third paragraph you could spend, just talking about how a teacher, knowing that, these particular aspects of this concept or understanding is difficult, will support the collaboration in these ways.
Mhm.
That's a lot of text, right? Like 3 paragraphs is like almost like a page, right? So, but you can see how, in a 7-page thing, you can go very deep to show that you understand the learning aspects of this particular thing and then richly build around it. And everything I'm talking about is design and rationale, as opposed to just a superficial kind of like, and they'll collaborate. And this is the sad thing sometimes that I ran across, which is the idea and organization as a whole was great, but because they didn't scope down, they had very limited opportunity to really think deeply about what these designs would look like and how they would support.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah. But I mean, overall, I think people did a great job. I
Mhm.
mean, um, I'm kind of excited to see how folks take the feedback that we provide them in this phase and then apply it again in a amped up version for the next step, the next half, the last half, the last half. I
Yeah.
can't believe we're already this far into the course.
What's that?
I can't believe we are this far into the course. I
It goes
cannot
by
believe it.
fast.
It goes by very fast.
Yeah.
But that's the point of all this feedback too, is so that folks can recognize what they're doing well, and then also where they can improve the next time they come across a similar challenge. And there will be many.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, the advice I would give, like to at least my class, right, is, continue to think about phenomenon in terms of obviously all these different kinds of aspects of learning, right? To come up with very clear objectives and goals of what you want to do, to reference those objectives and goal in your own self-checking of everything you decide to do as a design. Which objective am I really trying to hit? And does the way in which I'm shaping my design actually help with that objective, or is it something else? Right. And then another kind of thing is, again, it's like for these kinds of things, we are also kind of trying to get an exercise of how we can see connections between the things we're doing and other theories and ideas that have been posed in this class. And some of my students have been doing this very well. Some make do less of it than others, but for the ones that have, it's like not only if they have a good structure, right, and then they're coming up with designs for objective 1 or objective 2, but then like they've done a pretty good job this year, I think, of reaching out to other resources to support the rationale of why they're going to do something in a certain way. So, it's like, we're going to continue to learn these different kinds of strategies or techniques, and aspects of design. Thinking about what those things mean in implementation, I think is something to continually work on and do. And at the end of the day too, and last thing I'm going to say, I have too many things to say, is communication. In some ways, many ways, design isn't just the actual design itself, but it's how you convince people, right, that the design is sound, that we should do
Glad
it.
you brought that up. Yeah.
I often call this a design argument, a position, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to convince your peers, right, in your teachers conference that they should try this, right? We should implement this, or we should spend the money on it. And to do that, right, I mean, all the things we talked about is part of that argument. But I think also one thing to keep in mind is, especially with constraints, like you only have 30 minutes to present or 7 pages to do, how quickly can you get to the meat of your argument is important. And I think I understand some of you guys, it's more difficult. It's not your native language, etc. But I tend to think it's less about native language and more about the way you think about how what you're saying and how that supports or has nothing to do with your argument. Some people are very good at efficiently getting quickly to the point they want to make and then richly building around that, as opposed to, let's say, like beating around the bush and talking about things in really big spaces before they can finally, like on page 5, narrow down to the aspect they're actually going to be focused on in their design and stuff. And so, it's like, those are techniques I think that you could also think about. What does it mean to quickly and efficiently get to the focal aspect of your narrative argument, and then to talk lots specifically within that focus and constraint. And so, like, to me, it has less to do with English. It has more to do with the way your mind can make those kind of boundaries and define a space and articulate it, than anything else. So hopefully, throughout the next couple of weeks, you'll also get some examples and stuff, but something to think about as well. I think the communicative aspect is also just as important.
Agreed. I think that's a huge component. I think being able to have other people follow your vision to see what you're actually trying to do here is critical. I'm still working on it. It's a continuous improvement.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, like, I don't think that as a master's student, I had that down. I think it took me until, like, when I was in my doctoral program, and I think I've shared the story a lot, right? Like, I was fine. I was a great student.
Of course.
Poorly, except I failed my cert exam, right?
Did you really?
Yeah, I failed my cert exam the first time. That's like write a scholarly paper, like 20 something pages in like 2 hours or something like that. But
no, it was, it's pretty tough.
It was the first time anyone's ever told me about the idea that scholarly writing, which this kind of is, right? I mean, in reality, when you're designing in an organization, you might not have as many references and stuff, but this is kind of, we want to kind of be able to assess not just your design, but how you are reaching into the scholarly works to support it, even if in reality, you wouldn't overtly articulate that. Here in this class, we are looking for aspects of that as well. But no one ever told me that, like, I guess I wasn't a bad writer, but in that particular context, right, what they were looking for and what I had experienced in terms of what people told me about how I write and think was totally wrong, right? Different. It was only after that experience that I realized that my ideas of what it means to make a position and to communicate that efficiently, to what the difference between, you have to be broad, you have to have breadth and depth. What the hell does
that mean?
Is it one or the other, right? But this idea of depth from deciding where your focal space is, and then within here, richness, right?
Yes. Yep.
That concept, even me talking about it right now isn't going to make sense to people, right? But I guess I'm just saying, I'm a native writer and I couldn't do it. I don't think it's a writing issue. It's how you see and think about phenomenon and bring in and make definitions of where it is and bring other stuff in. Anyways, wasn't until I guess
probably had the same reviewer, because I got the
would be
same
like year 3,
on
right?
my cert.
So, to be really, really nice, right? Like I would say that there are certainly master students in my class who do it way better than I used to be able to do it. Back when I was a student of the same level, right? So kudos to you guys. Like many of you guys are smarter than I am. I just have many more years of like running ahead than you. So this is why, like, if I
Good
stop
answer.
running, you'll catch up and take over my job, which I cannot have you do. Yeah,
Take that, Joe. But I think that that's the good part, is that we're all in this process kind of continually learning. I didn't start in that spot either. And I'm going to be honest, I think I still work on articulating my ideas for the academic space, but also for the professional space, which sometimes are very different.
Yeah.
Stakeholders at a job might receive this information a little differently than the context that we're operating in right now.
Yeah.
But having this foundation allows me to be more prepared when I do have to bring my ideas to the field. I'm more confident. I'm comfortable.
Interesting.
That type of thing.
Cool. Well, stuff to think about. I mean, we'll be talking more about this kind of stuff as we go forward towards the final, and you'll be seeing your stuff back soon, I guess. And you'll also be seeing an update about the final exam specifications soon as well. So until then, see you guys around.
A good one, guys.
Take care, Ariel.
Bye.